Anchoring the Waldorf on the eastern side of the island by an easily accessible cliffside, we crowded into one of the longboats and cast off. Upon reaching the vine-grown rocky cliffside shore, we met the crew of the Hysteria in person. A crew of 4, they were an odd bunch to look at. Their captain's wild brown hair and thick beard, whilst extravagant enough on their own, were eclipsed by his intricate brass goggles and utterly preposterous top hat, which bore upon it an array of strange mechanical movements which ticked and whirred with his every expression. By his side there stood the mechanic, a shockingly young-looking Asian woman in dark blue coveralls with a wide leather belt laden with tools. The ship's doctor was a rather tall man in a black tailcoat, but the mechanical noises beneath his waistcoat betrayed his biomechanical status. A stout man with tattooed arms and sculpted hair, answering for the Hysteria's quartermaster, carried under his shoulder a rucksack, from which he produced an assortment of 7 blades, machetes, cutlasses, and boarding axes, which he distributed amongst our party for the purposes of clearing paths through the overgrowth. Consulting the detailed map of Locura given to us by Parnassus Laboratories, outlining the expedition, we noted the modular laboratory's location at the foot of the western slope of a large hillock at the island's center. We would have been able to spy it from our skyward approach if not for the cycad canopy. On the southwestern slope of the hillock, far from the island's edge, were situated the expedition's living quarters. We elected to separate into 3 groups to cover the most ground in the shortest amount of time. The sun was drawing low, but the situation needed to be assessed immediately. I would lead 6 from our party along the northern edge of the island to the laboratory, whilst Atkinson would take 5 along the southern edge towards the living quarters. The crew of the Hysteria agreed to take on 2 of our technicians as escorts, and search through the forest at a southwesterly course. Each of our 3 teams had a portable wireless transmitter with which to contact each other and the Waldorf. Both Atkinson's team and mine had short-range anachronometers to analyze the effects of the warp fields. The Hysteria's crew had their own strangely designed equipment, the nature of which they did not feel inclined to explain to us. Synchronizing our wireless communicators and agreeing to check in with each other every hour, we set off on our separate ways. The path to our route along the northern edge of the island from the cliff was a precipitous descent from the outcropping ridge where we had alighted. The rocky precipice was slippery and wild with strange, pulpy vines that made the going very precarious. Stewart, who was carrying most of our apparatus, nearly tripped over one of them at an unseen crevice in the ground. Taking exquisite care to maintain our footing, we proceeded northward until we were faced by an insurmountable impediment. The path we were on terminated in an abrupt downward drop over the edge of the island to the ocean far below. A small outcropping of rock led around the immediate drop, but the way beyond it was a precipice of almost sheer verticality, with no apparent footholds or means of passage. We were thence presented with a difficult choice. We could turn around and circumnavigate the island's edge southward, but it was nearly 7 o'clock, and we would soon lose the sunlight. Reluctantly, we decided to take a direct route to the laboratory through the time-warped cycad forest, clearing a path with the axes and machetes we had been given by the Hysteria's crew. We were not enthusiastic about the prospect of setting foot in the new and antediluvian jungle, especially as the sun was swiftly waning, but we had little time to waste. We proceeded double file into the overgrowth, the 2 of us at the front clearing away the vines and stalks with our blades, all the while tracking our course with compass and position of the sun. Though the going was easy enough, we noticed almost instantly that the ground was laden with deep, heavy soil from which the trees had grown. We did not need to consult the anachronometer to guess how far warped by Van Buren's machine the ground had been to have weathered away into soil. The air of apprehension was thick as we pushed on. The gargantuan leaves of the canopy cast terrible, dancing shadows in the rays of the evening sun. and in the unearthly half-light the creeping vines that clung to the trees resembled writhing pythons, or the tentacles of some unthinkable leviathan. Though the island was no more than 20 square miles, we felt ourselves lost in a limitless wild of primal dread. None of us said a word as we trekked through the eerie thicket, but listened exquisitely for noises of any kind. There was, however, not a sound to be heard but the swaying of the trees in the wind. This forest, so it seemed, was all but lifeless, save for the vegetation and the test subjects that the expedition had brought with them, and of those we heard no sign. Neither did we hear nor see any trace of the members of that expedition. In the course of our flight we had each of us conceived, though we had not spoken of it, of what had befallen Van Buren and his team of researchers to have cut off all communication from Locura. But in the latent terror of this cyclopean morass of immeasurable eons, we could not help but feel that we would not find them living. We had been walking for nearly an hour when we first noticed the change in the air. Stuart's keen young nostrils gave us the first hint of something unusual, and potentially horrible. We all caught the odor quickly and shuddered at what it might imply, for it was unequivocally the smell of dead, rotting flesh. Following the scent through a tangle of stalks, all 7 of us gasped audibly at what lay prostrate and incomplete before us. Our relief at not finding a member of the expedition dead on the forest floor was eclipsed by the terrible implications of lurking peril that the carcass before us suggested. For the body was that of a gargantuan crocodile, the escaped subject of Van Buren's experimentation. From what remained of it, we judged its size to have been prodigiously extrapolated by the warp fields, but we could clearly see that most of it had been torn away. The creature's reticulated hide was violently rended in several places, as if by sheer brute force. By the twisted posture in which the thing lay, we judged its spine to have been snapped. Its tail and lower jaw were missing, and it was evident that they had been viciously ripped from their joints. The most alarming thing, however, were the numerous chunks of flesh missing from the animal's back, and the cannibalistic intent that the teeth marks around them suggested. We judged by the state of decay that the crocodile had been dead for at least 24 hours. Attempting to ascertain what manner of savage horror could possibly be responsible for the massacre of such a robust predator, we looked about for traces of the alpha predator's identity, and came across a set of footprints in the thick soil beneath the vines. The impression was quite large, about 10 inches in length, and the form and distribution of the digits pointed to a simian nature. Closer inspection of the bite marks on the crocodile further hinted that the culprit was the escaped chimpanzee, though the depth of the footprints in the soil indicated its weight to be upward of 200 pounds. Clearly, the experiments performed upon this ape had warped it to monstrous levels of size and brutality. The thought of such a savage behemoth stalking about the forest filled us with new dread, and we feared that we had at last discovered what had dispatched Van Buren's company. But we felt it necessary to push forward in the hope of finding some sign of possible survivors. Before proceeding, we checked in with Atkinson's party and the Hysteria's crew over the wireless, notifying them of our discovery and cautioning them to be on their guard. They replied in acknowledgment and informed us that they had found little worth noting beyond the same observations we had made about the forest and the soil. Atkinson averred that his party were nearing the expedition's living quarters and would report back when they had arrived. Captain von Arkham had little to say other than a further word of caution. So we pressed on. keeping a tight hold on the tools we had been given, and wishing that we had brought along firearms. We walked a further half-mile in palpable unease, when we spied a vast, dark bulk behind the cluster of trees before us. Clearing through the vegetation, we saw that it was the airship Albatross that had carried Van Buren and his researchers to Locura 5 months ago. A 3-decked vessel chosen for its cargo capacity, it now sat tilted and hanging off of its ground struts, heaved upward by the trees that had sprouted from the warped ground beneath it. It was thickly overgrown with vines, but we cleared enough of them away to free the doors of its cargo hangar and went aboard. The authority has been mercifully conservative in its public report detailing the findings of our investigation, and I have no wish to elaborate on the identities of the 5 men we found dead aboard the Albatross. I will speak only to the condition of the bodies that caused one of our party to faint, and a further 2 to become suddenly ill. All 5 had been in some terrible kind of struggle, and were torn and mangled in brutish and altogether appalling ways. It was clear that death had come in each case as a result of laceration or dismemberment. Each of the poor souls bore the same frightful mauling and bite marks that we had seen on the crocodile, and we surmised that they had fled to the ship in an attempt to barricade themselves from the warped chimpanzee, but that the beast had found them before they could take off. Its means of entry, so far as we could tell, was the entry hatch on the top deck, having discovered it forcefully prized open from the outside. We judged the condition of the bodies to be too disturbing to carry back with us for a proper burial, and hoped that the authority and their families would understand. Searching the rest of the ship, we found the telltale signs of the frantic struggle in nearly every cabin. Instruments and articles of furniture and fixture were erratically strewn about the rooms and corridors, and a haunting dried trail of blood leading off the top deck illustrated to us the monster's egress. From the top deck of the Albatross we could spy in the dim half-light beyond the trees to the south the shape of the expedition's modular laboratory, and estimated it to be no more than 1/4 of a mile away. Though it was getting quite dark, and the prospect of traversing even the shortest distance of that loathsome thicket was becoming prodigiously more disheartening, our work was not yet complete. Searching the ship, we found and armed ourselves with 6 electric harpoons, traditionally used for fending off sky kraken, and this went a short ways to alleviate the apprehension. Mustering our courage, we illuminated our lanterns and left the vessel by the way we had entered.